Welcome to the Untangling Web3 podcast, your go-to hub to learn insights and the latest developments in the wild and wonderful world of Web3. I'm Alec Burns.
And I'm Jack Davis. Tune in each week as we navigate and explore the rapidly emerging landscape of the Web3 technologies, projects, and ideas that are shaping the future of the internet.
We'll be talking to the best and brightest in the industry to keep uncovering insights,
so that hopefully we can all learn together on our journey to untangle Web3. Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Alec, how you doing, mate?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very good. As you can see, I've got a change of setup. I'm actually back home in Birmingham. Some people thought that my mum would be on the show this episode, but no, not this week.
No, nice. Well, yeah, it's good to see you. Good to see you in your natural habitat for once.
Thank you, sir. So, importantly, who are you, Jack?
Who am I? Is that your accent creeping in?
No. Don't be so coy. This is this week's episode. We're talking about digital identity, and that's the element we want to cover, right? Who are you? How do you prove who you are?
Yeah, exactly. Slightly cheesy inroad, but it's an important way to start, I think, because today we are talking about digital identity, which is a big topic in Web3. And also slightly philosophical. I know we got philosophical with AI. Maybe we won't go that far today, but it does invoke the question about, what is identity at its core? So yeah, who am I and how do I prove it? That's kind of the central question we're going to be thinking about today, right?
Exactly. I mean, we kind of referenced identity a lot in previous episodes, like proving who you are. We kind of mentioned it in the AI episode. How do you prove that someone is real? How do you prove, the provenance of deepfake, all these kind of things. But I think it's a huge topic, digital identity. And we'll kind of see a bit later that a lot of the aims of digital identity kind of align with the aims of Web3. And you kind of need both to have like a successful implementation of either. But yeah, should we kick off in the way that we always kick off by going back to ancient UG times?
Yeah, why not? I think it's good let's recap overall the concepts and history of identity itself, and then we can move on a little bit to digital identity and what that means in Web3. So yeah, what do you know about ancient history and identity? Have you got any thoughts?
Identity early on in I suppose in most things that we spoke about, we go back to ancient times, was super simple. You had really small communities, small tribes of like less than 150 people, and identity was just what you could remember about someone, right? It's really hard to fraud an identity when I know Jack on a personal level. I know all of his negative traits, and he can't lie about those because I'll hold him to account. So identity early on was super simple. You didn't have to worry about kind of identity moving from place to place so much, because it was just the people in your tribe, and they knew and they had a history of you, and there was rumors and gossip about the person. So it's quite simple in the ancient times, I assume.
Yeah, and the problem of verifying identity kind of maybe didn't exist to such an extent, because you kind of already know, you've already pre-verifying people based on who you know, and to as you say, to forge someone's identity is much more related to wearing a mask or changing your hair color or whatever, trying to physically impersonate someone, right? Which is kind of important. This is way pre-digital, so the only way you could impersonate someone was with some physical changes you could make.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to go down the route of philosophy, but if you've read the book Sapiens, you know that there was a hard limit on the amount of people we had in the tribe, about 150 people, because that is the maximum number of people that we could actually remember characteristics and qualities on, which is super interesting. But as societies grew and became more complex, we actually needed forms of identification that kind of came into play, like seals and badges, and letters of introduction that kind of attested to something. You could say like, this person is a good person, this person has a criminal record, this person is very good making metal and things like that. So as society grew more complicated and we had to move from, say, tribe to tribe, for example, we actually needed to prove our identity and maybe more importantly, our credentials, what we could actually do from this one tribe to the next tribe. And we can think about this as like portability. It's probably the Web3 term that we probably use to describe this, right?
Yeah, and as you get to kind of like, you know, the Middle Ages and things, you start seeing these heraldries and coats of arms you get to describe different tribes or different factions of people. And I wonder how much of that is a consequence of things like the need to go to war, right? Because you need to identify which side you're on by what color you're wearing and what flag you're marching under. I mean, I think in Game of Thrones, you know, that's a good that's a good example of that kind of early group identity system you might have.
Yeah. When we bring this back to like the Web 2, Web 3 model, I imagine like the lord of the area whose coat of arms you wore. That's like the central authority, right? And you've been kind of bestowed this with the coat of arms that actually on behalf of that central authority. I imagine that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and also that's, I think you definitely have a clear example coming in there as we have more tribal or international wars throughout history. The need to verify someone's identity as part of those clans became much more important. You know, to be able to root out if someone was infiltrating from, you know, behind enemy lines, for example, you needed some way of trying to identify them, and obviously that would be something like a code word or something. But it doesn't get to the heart of individual identity, right? It's still just a tribe-based thing.
Yeah, well, I don't know why you're so focused on war. Like, is that going to be like your use case throughout? It's all about war through the ages.
Yeah, I didn't plan this. I mean, it just came into mind. I was like, well, if we're talking about coats of arms, then Game of Thrones makes me think of war too much. But yeah, I mean, I guess that covers the kind of the early systems and the first few 100,000 years or something of human civilization. And then by kind of the 19th century, you then start getting more formal versions of identity issued, and you get this concept of identification issuance, right? By governments, you have state issued identities, passports, and things that form as your kind of centralized form of identification coming from a central party like your state, rather than identity just being this this kind of local concept you have amongst people.
Yeah. So I guess that happened in like the 19th century, right? And then kind of advancing from that, we had more kind of, well, I guess better attestation to identity. It wasn't just like, you know, talked before about ownership, saying I have this piece of paper, so that means that it's mine, and it means something for me specifically. But then we kind of moved into the realm with more technology, as technological advancements kind of increased, of fingerprints and photographs, and actually having some way to attest that that document is actually for you. So it's not just holding it personally in your kind of your possession, which we kind of get into the realms like data and all this kind of stuff we mentioned in the data sovereignty episode. It's also provably saying this actually means something for me, and I can prove that by, you know, showing the picture on this document is actually a picture that is for me. And the same with fingerprints. So this is when it started to get a bit more interesting and a bit more maybe easy to verify.
Yeah, and it's clear that, you know, technology was the driver for improving identification, having more solid attestation of the characteristics, the unique characteristics of people. That you mentioned fingerprinting there as one example, and, you know, as you go later, you get to things like DNA and blood testing and things. And it's crazy how recent that is as a development in technology. I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of the like true crime dramas and things, documentaries. Sorry. It's incredible how much ambiguity there was in evidence for criminal proceedings before the technology became advanced enough to say definitively, okay, this evidence is attributed to this person. And that's only a recent thing.
I saw like whenever I watch those crime dramas, it was always like, oh, we've got his genetics everywhere. It's always like, how many crimes do you imagine there's like semen samples everywhere, and you've got like a backlog of all the semen, like all the people in the country. It's like so ridiculous, but they always use it somehow. They go like, we genetically match the semen here to the person over here. It's just ridiculous. That's just not how it works, is it?
No, exactly. I mean, it's unbelievable. The kind of to my mind, how frail the legal system would have been in absence of what we have now. I'm just quite glad we live in this age where you know, the criminals will be identified and things like that.
Yeah. When we're talking about like attestation as well, I don't want to jump the gun. We've already talked about fingerprints, and you kind of see that. I mean, most people will recognize that they have biometrics to kind of scan in, with their fingerprint to get into their phone, or even eye scan and face scans and all this kind of stuff. But like, I saw someone the other day who did a post about like having like blood scans and genetic scans to have like the purest form or the best form of attestation. That kind of quite scary, isn't it? That kind of stuff going that
Yeah.
far to have like blood storage and all this kind of stuff to attest to who you are.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also it speaks to the number of different ways you can be identified as a human being.
Mm.
I mean, it kind of explodes, or we get to the modern day. But even back then, the number of distinct characteristics you have as a human that you can measure is actually quite significant. So when you move on, then just we've kind of talked a little bit about biological markers and things, but you also then have kind of in the 19th century the advent of things like social security systems, where you then tie your identity to social benefits, to state issued benefits and things, and access to like government services, for example. We start seeing that, I think.
Yeah, and they have like, I suppose this kind of relates a bit later, but you'd have like unique identifying codes that represented you and were personally for you in some way. And I saw there were lots of issues around like the first social security systems where it's like 400,000 people or something like that shared like one social security number and like got the benefits from it or something like this. Like
Oh, really?
day hacks and yeah, it was
Where was
quite
that?
interesting. In America, I think, in the late 19th century, or something like this, or the mid 20th century, whenever it was brought in. But yeah, some of the earliest hacks, and like obviously this was just them trialing it out in the early days, and there was a lot of issues around that.
Yeah, exactly. So, what we've kind of stayed in the realm of physical identity almost, and physical markers of identity, physical systems based around identity. Then we kind of get what you call maybe the birth of digital ID in the late 20th century, when you start getting, things like driving licenses and ID cards that are linked to digital systems and using kind of computer databases and things. Yeah, is there anything else I've missed there?
I think that's a good one. Like it's interesting that a lot of the kind of the need for this or the necessity for this came from, say, automobiles, for example. Like the widespread adoption of automobiles meant that there needed to be like kind of an efficient way to attest to someone's ability for a driving license, right? And also to verify it quite efficiently. And I think this like led to kind of an emphasis or a drive in the area of digital ID. And like this was kind of enabled through, computer databases in the late 20th century that we've kind of spoke about in previous episode. So these databases allowed the easy management of like large scale identification systems, and also like made it more efficient, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're not quite talking yet about the kind of full blown digital identity systems that you kind of are looking at today. But there are some examples where countries really did embrace this change quite early. I mean, I know Estonia, for example, has had forms of digital identity in place, in all kind of government systems from, I think it was as early as the early 2000s, something like 2002. I think they've had this in place for, which is remarkable considering that you still don't have it in all countries in the world, and in lots of places it's not particularly advanced yet.
Well, it's interesting. Like for some reason, I mean, maybe this is prejudice. When I thought about Estonia previously, I was like, okay, probably not as advanced as say the UK. And then like I met a friend from Estonia, we became very close, and I went to Estonia, visited a couple of times, and I realized like how technologically advanced it was. Like it's crazy. They like invented Skype, like they have Wi-Fi absolutely everywhere. They had like publicly accessible Wi-Fi in Estonia and in Tallinn specifically for like 10 years or something crazy. Like for some reason, Estonia is really leading the game in a lot of these kind of technologies. Like, and like you mentioned, like the national identification system, they've had like decentralized ID like for a bit now, I think. It's just really interesting. There's like a little hub there of kind of technological innovation in the space.
Yeah, and it kind of came, talking about 2002, that also aligns with the advent of the internet, as we've spoken about, the early days of Web 1 and moving into Web 2. That's when we start getting new forms of communication. In particular, mobile phones become popular, email as well as a way to identify someone. I mean, I know by now there are lots of countries that will have government IDs. I think Italy is a good example in the EU, where you have a government system that will push out notifications. You send documents to citizens via email, and so email, coming from the early days of the internet, became a really, really popular source of identity and a way of verifying identity. I mean, it's pretty much the most common way I think my identity is verified now, right? Those emails you get to say go and click your verification link every time, or you get the magic sign-on links. I mean, some people just don't bother with some companies don't even use passwords now. You just get a sign-on link from your email.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, your email address is like incredible. badkidjack@95. It's just I wouldn't want to lose that either. It's a good attestation to who you are as a person. But yeah, I think like you say, like there in the late 90s, we saw the massive rise of like digital identity, the different form, being able to create usernames and passwords to access systems. And then there's also like the kind of the mass adoption of e-commerce, where digital identity became really crucial for transactions like online banking and shopping that required a reliable way to prove digital identity when someone was making a purchase, and verification systems. And this kind of pushed the kind of the area or the ecosystem even further technologically.
Yeah, and as you say, the rise of the internet. I mean, even as you come into the early 2000s and the 2010s, kind of early 21st century, that shift even from Web 1 to Web 2, as we've talked about, where social media becomes much more dominant, brings with it a number of different ways you can be identified. So, in particular, you get the rise of internet personas or pseudonyms. And I know we've had pseudonyms for a very long time. They would have been applicable in the 19th century and way further back. People writing under pseudonyms, but now they're so common on the internet. People have their handles on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram, whatever, which don't need to be tied to your real world identity, other than through maybe an email. But there's this kind of many to one relationship now with your online identity and your actual in-person physical identity, let's say.
Yeah, I think it's particularly important when we're going to talk about the final form maybe of digital identity, which is self-sovereign identity, which is definitely coming.
Spoiler alert.
And this many to one relationship is very important, because it kind of, in a way, it enables privacy. So it's like I can have a pseudonym that I use for, say, my banking account, and I can have a pseudonym that I use for maybe buying tickets to football matches. And I don't need to use the same pseudonym for both. And if, say, things are publicly viewable, or there's transparency there, like transactions happen on a public blockchain, it makes it more difficult to associate the two, maybe on the public blockchain. But also it means that, say, if I'm directly transacting with one using that pseudonym, they don't know that I'm directly transacting with the other as well. And I think this is quite important, right?
Yeah, and I think there are many cases where you do want your pseudonyms to be separate, and separate also from your public physical identity, your government identity as well. But there are other use cases which aren't really served well by the Web 2 world, where you might actually want to have them linked together. So I'm thinking like bringing your reputation between two different social media platforms, right? So you change platform where you wanted to add a new one. It's quite important to be able to link what you've done on one to another, which is not always an easy problem. This is the kind of interoperability challenge you have with digital identity as it is today, up to kind of 2020.
Yeah, and I've seen ones with like gambling. Say if someone's like a reckless gambler, and there's been restrictions placed on them, and they have like markers of harm that gambling company has to monitor to make sure that they're not, say, a danger to themselves. They don't spend money they don't have, for example. Well, you have a KYC where you register with gambling company A, and they monitor those markers of harm to make sure you don't overspend and you're safe and all healthy and all this kind of stuff. But if I all of a sudden then go to gambling company B and start to use them as a service provider as well, and then split the amount of spending between the two, and then not communicating because of these pseudonyms, that's an issue, right?
Yeah, massive issue. And another issue we've mentioned usernames, but we haven't mentioned the other counterpart, which is the passwords. So with all these online identities and usernames and accounts with different Web 2 companies, we also have the rise of the use of passwords. And as we've spoken about in the other previous episodes, that brings all these other challenges to do with phishing scams, password leaks, data breaches, that kind of thing. Like there's this whole plethora of problems, and the fact that these are linked to your identity now makes it so much worse, because what you can lose potentially if you lose your credentials, if someone takes your password or gains access to one of these accounts, they can potentially impersonate you quite easily.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing worse than phishing scams is my company's tests for phishing scams and security tests. Like, I get caught with those all the time. Like, phishing scams now are so advanced. Like, it's actually crazy. Like, we had that Rafaela talking about them. She got caught, and there's quite a few people that I know that've been caught. These like tech savvy people. So yeah, identity theft and phishing scams are a massive problem that's kind of become apparent because of this.
And actually, another just a point to add to that, because we're talking about identity, and if you are the victim of one of these scams, your identity details, like your email address, your phone number, your address, your house address, anything like that, your name, will then get shared around others, right? So basically,
Oh,
victims
really?
of scams. Yeah, this is a lot of
What?
scamming companies become essentially data brokers to other scam companies. I've been watching a few videos on it recently that are really fascinating. I don't know if you've seen, there was a documentary around taking down a call center scam agency, but this is the thing, right? If you fall victim to one of these, your identity data is going to start hurtling around, and you become much more vulnerable.
God. That's absolutely crazy. And then what's the solution? Is the solution to have is it to keep it more distributed? Is single sign-on stuff a solution to this, where everything's managed by like Apple or Google or something like this? Or is it safer to have distributed accounts and distributed users' names and passwords for each of them? Because it's crazy, like how many accounts and passwords I have like to store right now. I probably have like 40 or 50 different username and password combinations for all the 40 or 50 different services I use. And the user experience on that is not good at all. That's like a really tricky for me to remember, to like have all these things at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there's one easy solution to all this, right? Because as you say, if you introduce things like password managers and single use passwords, that brings this user experience challenge, but it still doesn't completely solve the problem. And as you mentioned, single sign on, you get your sign in with Google, sign in with Apple, sign in with Facebook, and I'm guilty of using those, at being lazy quite often. And they introduce these central points of failure. So if you then if you then lose your someone hacks your password and gains access to one of these accounts, then they can start very easily logging into all these other services which are effectively connected to it. So yeah, I don't know if there's a single particular solution. And as we're going to get on to talking about sovereign identity and identity systems in Web3, I think there are still big challenges there. But a lot of the problems in the Web2 world are coming from what we spoke about in the data sovereignty episode, the fact that you are giving away far too much information to access services. And that's what I mean by, if a company gets hacked, then that's when your data goes around the scamming world, right? Because they should have been holding the data in the first place. Ideally, you should have been able to prove your identity without giving all that over and letting them and having the company keep the data.
Yeah. I think I suppose some of the technological kind of solutions we have to this like identity theft stuff to mitigate that is around one, multi-factor authentication, right? Which I personally hate. Like, I hate it so much, but I see that it's useful. I understand why we need it, and it's better than the alternative of me remembering all my passwords constantly. Yeah. The other one that I really do like is biometric. Fingerprint scans, attesting to my identity. Like, it's obviously quite tricky to do that with, say, mobile devices, web apps, all this kind of stuff. That's pushing more and more to say mobile device. I think I said mobile devices twice there. Pushing more to mobile devices rather than laptops and computers. And I think that directly aligns with the kind of the self-sovereign identity stuff that we're going to talk about as kind of maybe the final evolution of digital identity potentially.
Yeah, exactly. I think I agree. These are quite important, even if they might be cumbersome or introduce new problems. I mean, we're getting more used to things like biometric identification. Like if you sign up for a kind of a challenger bank or something these days, your KYC will often involve you having to take a photo and having say a sentence or something, which is a kind of form of biometric ID. I think I've recently changed my banking login to now they have login with your voice. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I have. What, do you ever pass the human check for the voice test or not?
Yeah, I can't access my bank at all now, unfortunately. No, but yeah, they all kind of do partially solve the problem. But I agree, to kind of bring us on to this concept of where we are now and with digital identity in Web3 and self-sovereign identity, which we'll kind of define in a moment. I think that is potentially the end state where you're combining a lot of these Web2 security features with a different paradigm for dual identity in the first place.
Yeah, so like you were talking, well, previously about them kind of housing all the identities and all the data on there, and then where we're at today is around using, blockchain technology for decentralized digital identities, where you shift some of the control of the user data to the users themselves that are actually controlling that data, and away from like the big corporations. And there's a lot of benefits that we've spoken about previously. I think like a lot of this stuff directly aligns with the data sovereignty episode that we did, having smaller attack surfaces, if all say what's Facebook now, 2 billion people's worth of identity information is stored in a central server in Facebook. That's a big attack surface. You want to invest a lot of money to get that data. But if we start to push that to users and have 2 billion separate devices, each with one, say, identity piece of data, underpinned quite importantly with blockchain technology, then we have a more, say, kind of powerful security solution.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it's worth us now trying to put a bit of a definition on self-sovereign identity, or SSI as we'll kind of refer to it. So I mean, I'm happy to have a go first, although it's going to be pretty hand wavy because I think it's quite a general term. So kind of to me, self-sovereign identity is the umbrella term that captures this concept of moving away from the types of Web2 digital identity systems we've just talked about. All these account-based things where you have to hand over too much information, passwords get stored and leaked, and essentially moving, as you said, moving the verification and storage of identity data to the users instead of holding it in big corporations. SSI essentially describes the overarching goal and ambition of digital identity in the Web3 world, I think. I mean, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, like that's perfect. Like I think the nuance between like decentralized identity and SSI is kind of hard to define. But I think like SSI, like you said, there is the end goal, and the end goal is a solution where individuals have full control over their identity, the data that's in that identity. And I think a lot of people say there's like no reliance on trusted third parties or central authorities and all this kind of stuff. I don't think that's true. You're always going to have some point of trust, right? Like we can't just have I produce my own identity, Jack produces his own identity, then we can interact. No, I still need to know that Jack is Jack, and we still need, say, the government of the UK to say, Jack is actually Jack and Alec is actually Alec. The point is that we reduce that reliance. We don't need the government to say every single time me and you have a conversation, Jack, the UK government says, yeah, this is Jack and this is Alec. We just say they produce a credential, say this is Jack, and they sign off on it using cryptographic proofs, and then we can interact based on that kind of trusted ecosystem that's been provided by the UK government signing off on that. And
yeah,
you want to jump in there?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to kind of, because you're resonating with what I've heard some people describe as the definition of identity is kind of your identity is the aggregate of what people around you will say, right, and attest to characteristics of you as well, because you have them. You do have innate characteristics, but a big part of it is what other people will recognize and be able to attest to. So I think this model of you can claim to be something, but then a lot of the time you need that claim to be verified or authenticated by a third party. That's the kind of just the reality of it.
And I think, like, the way I think of it, you always have a root kind of trust, and it's always that the UK government and gives Jack his equivalent of a driving license in the digital space that says he is Jack and he lives here and he's a real person. And then you can have like kind of different trust points that are built from that anchor. Say, if you're in a gaming environment and you want to build up a reputation that you're really good at Call of Duty or something like that, like the degree of trust there is less serious, right? We don't need like full cryptographic proofs, like a trusted peer-to-peer interaction, all this kind of stuff. But you can build up your own kind of persona based on what you're actually doing in game, rather than needing like a full cryptographic secure proof over the top of it. But if it's say something like you need to spend like £20,000 on a transaction buying a new BMW or something like this, then the kind of the trust there needs to be a bit stronger, right? And we probably need more checks and a bit more kind of security there. So like there's different points around this, right? And this kind of all ties back into the many to one relationship. We're talking about pseudonyms. It's not like I need that central point of trust for everything. I need to reveal all my core information every single time. We can selectively choose what's applicable where.
Yeah, different claims about you and your identity will require different levels of proof and different levels of attestation from others. I'm conscious that we're still being relatively abstract about like what SSI is and decentralized identity, but I know that there are some quite concrete concepts around it. Like a lot of the ideas have been standardized now by organizations like W3C. So I don't know. Can you explain? Because I know you're quite familiar with the terms around how you establish a digital identity system, what the kind of entities are involved, and how they kind of relate to each other.
Yeah, you're right. Like I think maybe the actors in the ecosystem at a high level are quite defined, and they lend themselves a lot from like traditional identity systems. So the key actors, or the kind that we're talking about we have issuers, holders, and verifiers at quite a high level. So it's like the issuer could be, I keep saying it, but the UK government, they give you your passport, Jack. They give you your driving license, and maybe a university would be another good example. They issue you your degree certificate. Okay. So they're like the certificate authority, and they're the ones that can credential you and say, Jack has a driving license, Jack has this degree, all this kind of stuff. So they're the trusted party there. And like I say, we'll always need that trusted party. Everyone will always kind of rely on a trusted party. It's just maybe reducing the reliance. So the other party is the holders. So in that case, Jack, it's you, the kind of the subject. It's often referred to as well. So it's the credentials we talked about previously. The information pertains to you. It's given by the issuer, but it pertains to you. It says that you can drive. It says that you have this degree. And then the final party is the verifier. They're the people that are actually interested in proving that this information is true and that it actually relates to you. So it could be a police officer that's pulled you over for a DUI or something like that, and they want to prove that your license is real, for example.
You're pulling from experience there, Alec.
No, never. No points on my license. Probably because I mostly don't drive. Or it could be a recruiter or a company that wants to prove that you actually have a degree and it's actually a real degree that applies to you. So they're the three parties. So the issuer, they issue credentials to the holder, and the verifier verifies those credentials of the holder. So there's a relationship there. And I think that's quite a standard relationship in digital identity before blockchain was introduced. So the interesting thing about SSI and decentralized identity is that when we're signing credentials now, we're actually using cryptographic signatures that intrinsically link the credential itself to the information that's contained within the driving license, to the person as well, to say that it relates to this holder specifically, and from the issuer. So we've got a way to easily verify all that information in one go. And we kind of underpin that using the blockchain. So we can put that information on the blockchain to get all the benefits that we've previously spoken about, like the immutability, the ability to have transparency and provably say that this information is up to date and things like this. And when we're saying like a lot of people want to remove the need for trusted parties, what they're actually saying is we have the trusted party that instigates the initial credentialing and giving the credential. And then after that, rather than the verifier needing to go to that issuing party every time they want to check that Jack actually has a degree, they can actually rely to an extent on the blockchain and say, do I check that this is still valid, for example? And that becomes a much more efficient process. Like if you've ever tried to verify a university degree, it's a long task. Like universities aren't open, 24/7. It takes them weeks to get back to emails, say, is this real? Yeah. Imagine if I could just put a certificate on the blockchain, know that it's from the university itself by knowing what their public key is basically, or the signing tool they use, and then instantly verify it. I mean, that's like a really efficient system. And I've seen like some of the stats around, I think McKinsey did a massive report on if there was a fully instigated SSI model in some like Western countries, it would lead to an increase in GDP of 6 to 13%, just from efficiency, convenience, fluidity, ability to just jump into different services and goods constantly. It's a hugely game-changing SSI.
Yeah, I think that's why I definitely see it as such a Web3 concept, is that it's a much more efficient way, as you say, of doing and verifying identity. It just makes more sense. And the kind of two components you were mentioning on, like, why is that the case? Yeah, you have the blockchain as a persistent, reliable source of data for lots of these
Mhm.
things, and we'll come on to some other kind of terms like DIDs in a moment. But the blockchain is fundamentally a great platform to build a digital identity system on, decentralized identity system on, and then the cryptography itself as well is almost this tool that's allowing for verification. Like the advent
Yeah.
of, I mean, cryptography isn't that modern cryptography is the kind of things we're actually talking about here are only kind of 30-40 years old, like public key
Mm.
infrastructure systems, that they are quite new. And these are what allow lots of the credentials to be stored with the individual, because you can publicly verify something without knowing the actual information. That's kind of the key principle. um
Yeah, and I think something I didn't say is that like the information is held by the user still in like a
yeah
perfect SSI environment. Like they still own, say, their driving license and all the data within it on their device. So it doesn't necessarily have to be stored in like a central server that everyone can potentially hack into. And it's just like when I reveal the data on my mobile device to say so a verifier who's interested in it, they can verify the integrity and authenticity of that data
yeah
using public key infrastructure that you've already mentioned in cryptographic proofs.
yeah a kind of simple way, maybe way to talk about it, is like the data is private and then the proof is public, or is something that can be made
Exactly.
public, that kind of. Yeah.
Exactly. And the
um
proof itself doesn't reveal that much information. The thing that's actually on the
exactly.
blockchain doesn't reveal any information, particularly about that data.
Yeah. So I think maybe just before we move on about from our kind of base definitions, it's worth defining two quite popular terms. So one of them is, and it doesn't help that we've got decentralized identity and also
Mhm.
um, uh, decentralized identifiers, but in general we just refer to them as DIDs. And you
Mhm.
also have verifiable credentials, which is kind of a lot of what you've been talking about already with credentials that you'd issue, and they're referred to as VC. Um, so maybe I'll tackle the DIDs first. So my
Mhm.
understanding is that a decentralized identifier is similar to what you've been describing, but it refers to the actual thing that uniquely identifies you in the digital
Mhm.
ecosystem. So it has to be
Yeah.
something that is globally unique. There is like a one-to-one mapping between you as a human entity and this digital world. So this is what gives you the anchor point into the identity system. So as a user of self-sovereign identity system, you would have a DID, you would have a unique digital decentralized identifier. And the other component of that is often linked to something what's called a DID document, which contains kind of the basic information about how that information relates to you. And it won't necessarily include any personal information. Normally, it will just include some
Mhm.
kind of cryptographic information, as you were saying, some certificate on some public key that means you can prove statements, or statements can be proven
Yeah.
about you, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really great, like summary. And I think the really interesting things about DIDs is that on this like W3 standard that's kind of emerging as like the standard for SSI, is that the individual fully controls that, right? That's not shouldn't really be given by like a central authority. They should be able to spin up however many they want. Could it be thousands, hundreds, millions? But it also doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? It's just say a string that is unique and could pertain to me. But say if I want to go on, I want to buy something online, I need to prove I'm over 18. My DID doesn't mean anything. I still need verifiable credentials that relate
Exactly.
to that DID to actually get some usefulness from it. And I think if we move on to the verifiable credentials that are kind of hinted towards, they're like digital statements that are made by
Yeah.
issuers like governments or universities and things like this about the subject, which can be cryptographically verified by a third party. Okay, but it's like really
Yeah.
there that you need DIDs plus the verifiable credentials to start to get the usability and the actual kind of use cases that we'll move on to a bit later.
Yeah, and I think maybe one thing to add there to distinguish DIDs and verifiable credentials, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in my mind, it's like DIDs are something which can be self-issued if you want.
Mhm.
You could establish your own unique digital identifier and the corresponding DID document, but then the verifiable credentials are the things that will be issued by other people on that DID, right? So you could issue your DID, but then the government would issue the verifiable credential. The university would issue the verifiable credential on you, essentially.
Exactly. And I think this is kind of like the misunderstanding that emerges sometimes when people say there'll be no need for central trusted parties and all this kind of stuff. Is, yeah, to an extent that might be true. People can spin up DIDs, self-allocate DIDs, whatever they want. And maybe for some interactions, like you just want to game on something like that, that's fine. You can just use that DID to interact in the metaverse, whatever. But for a lot of interactions where you need to prove you're a person, prove that you're 18, all this kind of stuff, it's the verifiable credentials that are given by a trusted third party, basically, that will actually enable a lot of use cases and applications to prove who you are and who your identity and what your characteristics are.
Yeah, exactly. And as you were saying, you still need these trusted third parties, but they're on the issuance of the credentials, not the actual issuance of the identity, basically. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think a really interesting thing about the W3C standard as well is that on the verification side, it's actually one of the objectives that the issuing third party, like the government who gives you a driving license, shouldn't know when there's a verification that takes place. So like the UK government should know if you go to an off license and use your passport digitally to say you're above 18, for example. And that's quite an interesting kind of objective of SSI from the W3C standards.
Okay, well, why don't we consult our friend, as I always call him, ChatGPT, to just double check on the definitions and make sure we've kind of covered everything so far. So ChatGPT says, in the context of Web3, digital identity refers to a set of verifiable, self-sovereign, and decentralized digital attributes or credentials associated with a specific entity, such as an individual, organization, device, or application. These credentials can be used to present, verify, and manage the identity of the entity on the internet without the need for centralized authorities or intermediaries. The control and management of this identity data rest with the entity itself, enhancing privacy, security, and user agency. So yeah, not bad. I think maybe I would take a little bit of issue there with how it's saying, without the need for centralized authorities, because we've kind of established you still need that for the verifiable credential side, but maybe not on the management of the actual identity itself.
Yeah, definitely. Like we're always going to need a trusted entity, like be it the government, be it the university. Like we do need someone to credential us in most use cases. I'm saying most use cases, maybe not all use cases, especially for the kind of the low trust or ones like gaming and things like that, where you actually don't really care who you're interacting with so much, and the identity doesn't matter too much. But at that stage, like the identity doesn't matter either, right? You could just use an IP address or something like that. So maybe it actually do need them in actuality for most applications where we need identity. I think an interesting thing about that ChatGPT definition was that it also said it's not just an individual, how we've kind of contextualized it. It's also organizations, devices, applications. I really like that because I think we've kind of, we've put out the IoT episode, right? And we talked about IoT devices and AI as well, having more agency and being like entities in their own right. And when we think about identity, we obviously always humanize, we think about people. But I think more and more in like hopefully utopian and not dystopian future, we are going to see the need to identify devices, and they're going to be able to do things and need to prove their identity as well. I think that's like a really interesting use case for this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you're already hearing people talking about civil rights for AI systems, so you'll definitely be having identity for AI if that goes any further. But maybe to not stray too much again into philosophy, and I think there's definitely lots to talk about in a future episode on that kind of stuff. But why don't we kind of bring it back to what's the actual relationship with Web3? Because we have thrown in lots of these terms from Web3. We've explained a little bit about why we think Web3 is related, but I think we can make it a bit more concrete. So I know you have some thoughts on how we're moving from normal digital ID to SSI. So I don't know if you have a way of kind of contextualizing that in Web3.
I think like I see a lot of parallels between SSI and Web3. And I think if we think of both as like the end points on a continuum, so the one continuum is centralized identity to decentralized identity to SSI, which is the final goal. And the kind of the end goal of that is around decentralization, user empowerment, right? And I think that's the same goals that apply to Web 1, to Web 2, to Web 3. It's moving more and more, it's moving more towards decentralization and user empowerment. And I think what they're kind of the successes, I think, in a way, are related. If we think of Web 3 as providing like the infrastructure for peer-to-peer, And then the self-sovereign identity enables user ownership and control without the complete reliance continuously on a central authority. So I think there's a mutual kind of dependence for success there. Like we're thinking about interaction in the metaverse and moving from application to application. You need like a real portable identity solution for that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Maybe also just to specifically pick up on the infrastructure piece, right? I think, as we've said with other things as well, but I think blockchain in particular, and a lot of the tools like the cryptography and the proof systems like zero knowledge proof we're seeing in Web3, they are just the natural infrastructure. They're the natural tools that you'd use to implement an SSI system to achieve these things on the end goal that you're talking about. I mean, blockchain has pretty much made the term decentralization one that everyone knows about now, from being something that would have been pretty obscure 10 years ago. And now it seems to be something that people will slap onto everything. And I think you can go way too far with that. But at the same time, as you say, it is getting away from holding everything in one central system to holding it in a more distributed system. And crucially, again, putting the data back in the hands of the user. And, we're already seeing blockchains in particular being used for that reason. People, it's the obvious choice. So if you look at something like the side tree protocol, this is something that was developed by some researchers at Microsoft, and they basically developed this DID protocol. So how the decentralized identifier looks, how it operates, how you manage it, how you add verifiable credentials. They built a system to do all this, and they actually anchored it in the Bitcoin blockchain. And it's something that is designed to be portable between blockchains. It is compliant with the W3C standards we mentioned, but it's mad that this has been taken seriously by companies like Microsoft, and they're using public blockchain infrastructure to achieve those goals.
That's very exciting. And I know that we're talking about something like, there are like key pillars in SSI, and you've mentioned it there, like portability is a big one. We've mentioned privacy and security. And I think, as with a lot of things, we're realizing this is a big topic that warrants, 2 or maybe even 3 episodes to really unpack properly. And I think we'll come on to those pillars in the next episode, and also the challenges and concerns that are associated with that. But I think for this episode, we should really maybe jump into some use cases that make it tangible and exciting and practical for everyday users to understand why SSI is important. Jack, what is the kind of leading exciting use case in your mind for an SSI solution?
So I think the one I'm really excited about is basically in the job market, in employment, because it brings together like 2 or 3 of these different topics we've been talking about into one place. So I think the verifiable credentials for basically everything that's on your CV is going to be really big in the future, for employers in particular, to be able to trust that what is the content of your CV is actually accurate and true. Right. I know people, it's a common thing about people. It's people always say, don't lie on your CV, but many people do lie on their CVs. And for the employers and recruiters who recommend candidates, they want to be able to check that the authenticity of your degree, of your professional qualifications. And we're already seeing it happen loads. And I think this will become the goal. This will become the standard. They'll have a blockchain based DID system with verifiable credentials issued by higher education institutions, by professional certifiers. It's just going to become the standard. So that's one aspect of how I think it'll play a role. The other then
spoken like a true good citizen, by the way, who has an accurate CV with no BS in there.
Exactly. I'm one of the good guys. So the other aspect, which is, because that's all from, I'd say that's more from the employer's perspective. I mean, it's good for people who are honest because it'll bring the standard up for everyone else. But it will also really benefit the people who are looking, the job seekers, right? People who are giving the CVs out, because I know there's this kind of culture, I think, of a bit like what I said with the data brokers and scams, your details being circulated. How do you know where your CV is going when you pass it over? If you get asked by a recruiter to they say, can I see your CV? You have no rights you have no way of enforcing your rights. You have no way of making sure they're not going to circulate that with 100 different companies. They're going to see your your
Yeah,
details.
yeah.
You just don't know where it's going, right? And
I imagine
I think,
recruiters just looking at my CV and laughing in the back office.
yeah, exactly. It's going to get embarrassing. It was only meant to embarrass one person, but a lot of the Web3 tools and techniques like selective disclosure, zero knowledge proofs, and just general kind of slightly more boring but access control management and certificates that we talked about previously. So when you give your CV over to a recruiter, you'll give it over with permissions. It won't just be a PDF that you send on LinkedIn. It'll be a blockchain based system where you say you have access to this, and only the person who has control of this public private key pair can read it. So you might encrypt it before you send it, for example, to a particular key pair that is tied to someone. I think that's going to become really important in the future to make it much more honest from the perspective of if you're seeking a job, basically. I think that I think that's just a very cool way to tie up both sides of the equation.
Oh yeah, it's all about the job market, baby. Like that. Yeah, it's really cool. Super excited. I think like on that stuff, like we talk about like read access and access one time, like a lot of it is application specific though, right? Like it's
Mm.
really, you have to have an application that would enforce that with with the kind of the blockchain underpinning that would actually allow, a one-time spend access to actually read the PDF once and then revoke access following that. And I think that's something that needs to come, right? It's quite not easy, but it's somewhat simple to implement that on a blockchain, a spending of a token and all this kind of stuff. But we're actually not really seeing the kind of the applications on the mobile end and the user end that actually enforce that kind of stuff right now. And I think, yeah, it would be really powerful if we could do that.
Yeah, for sure. So what about you, Alec? Is there any what's most? I know you love digital identity, so you must have an application you're really excited about for it.
I love everything. I love every topic we've done so far. So I think mine is something that everyone understands. It's like, have you been to an airport, Jack?
I have, yes.
Wow,
Surprisingly, I know you wouldn't
congratulations.
guess it from my lack of tan, but yeah.
How many checks were there when you went through the airport?
Oh, this is something I can see where you're going with this, because it depends wildly. Like if you go
International, you go into, let's say you go to America.
let's say 3, but what I will say is sometimes I've noticed that you get double checked, right? You go through one barrier and then you walk 100 yards and they check you again. It's like nothing's changed.
I hope you don't get called out in like a comedy show. You'd be the worst audience participant ever. I was expecting a simple
Sorry.
answer. You're making this about you. No,
sorry, you picked up on a pet peeve of mine. Sorry.
So yeah, you go to an airport. There are lots of checks. You have ticket checks, you have passport checks, you have boarding checks, visa checks, destination hotel checks in some countries. Obviously, COVID checks as well. You have records checks. It's carnage. It's absolute chaos. Like there are like 8 to 9 checks sometimes per international flight on going out, landing, and getting there, and all this kind of stuff. And imagine like when you're doing it on behalf of your kids as well. Like it's absolutely crazy having to imagine like all of these different documents. Some can be digitalized, some cannot be digital. That are just all over the place, and you have to find the right one and make sure it's like attesting to you. And you'll see that like for say a visa check, they'll also have to check your identity as well. And these are 2 separate documents in some cases, which is crazy. Now the solution for SSI is so obvious there. Imagine all of these like different checks and documents in one app that allow automatic verification of all of them amongst all of the others as well. Like the benefits are so obvious there. You have like streamlined travel, data minimization, and no centralized database potentially they're prone to breaches. But you also control and maintain the privacy and like the efficiency of checking with just one app on your phone, and not having to handle all these different documents and get different apps up and all this kind of stuff. It's just so obvious there. And I think when I was talking about the GDP increase for SSI solutions being like adopted widely in like an economy of like 8 to 14%, I think it was. Like it's things like that, like the lack of paperwork and the efficiency of being able to sign up and not duplicating KYC checks and all this kind of stuff. That's where you're going to see the real benefits to the economy. And I think that kind of stuff really excites me.
Yeah, no, I didn't realize it would excite me until you said it like that. Because the last flight I did go on, I both remember getting checked 2 or 3 times without changing location, essentially. So it's like, why do I need to check my passport 3 times to get on? And also, it was in an unbelievable queue, and I nearly missed my flight because it's such an inefficient process right now.
There you go. See, this is a real pain point. I think a lot of people like actually understand it. But yeah, that's why I find like such an exciting use case.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I think both of those are interesting, and there's going to be loads more that I think we'll have to do another episode on, as you said. But I think, yeah, we've covered some pretty good ground. I think we've laid the foundations of what digital identity is, what this overarching concept of SSI is, the Web3 kind of end goal, and then some of the components in that of DIDs and VC. And yeah, we'll maybe talk about some of the principles of a good digital identity system in the future, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the next episode, we'll cover some of the fundamental pillars of SSI, what the aims are. We've kind of alluded to some of them there, but also what some of the challenges and concerns are. And hopefully we'll also go into some of the technologies that underpin them in a bit more detail. And, maybe the most exciting is what the future looks like, how we tie all of this digital identity stuff into, some of the other buzzwords that are coming out like AI and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that wraps up this first part. Thank you to those listening wherever you may be, and join us next time as we untangle a little more of Web3. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.